We all know that the right habits and mindsets can be transformational in how we live our lives. But among the sea of advice online, it can be challenging to know who to trust with these important life decisions. At The Standard, we answer those questions and introduce you to some of the most successful people in the world in their fields and the habits and the mindsets they've used to achieve their success. To learn more about our social platform, head on over to www.thestandardapp.com. And now, your host, myself, Chris Palatroni. Welcome to another episode of The Standard. I am your host, Chris Palatroni, and today's guest is Tim Calise. He is a serial entrepreneur, having raised over $300 million for companies. He is now a business coach, an advisor, an investor to 10 to 15 privately held companies. And as he likes to say, he is the number 2 to the founder and CEO, helping companies turn their dreams into reality. This was a fun conversation. I felt like I had a lot in common with Tim, both being entrepreneurs and husbands, as well as fathers. And so I could really relate to how he goes about his day, if you will. And we talk a lot about his number one habit, which is journaling. This is the first time journaling has really come up in this context on this podcast. And I love the way he sort of described it. So we talk about the power of journaling and closing open loops and how that helped reduce some of the low-level anxiety that he was having and how long he's been doing that habit, which is quite impressive. And then we dive into mindsets and his mindset of being more present, both in his businesses as well as in his family life, and how he's used social contracts as a way to hold himself accountable to be more present. Lots of good little tidbits he brings into this, from the time management matrix to the Pareto principle. It was just a fun episode to sort of get Tim to share how he does what he does and the habits and mindsets that are really supporting him. So I think you guys will enjoy this. And we finished the episode off with his wish for the world and people being more self-aware. So really fun time talking with Tim. I hope you guys enjoy as well. And so without further ado, I want to welcome Tim Calise. Well, I really appreciate you joining us and being a guest on the podcast.
Yeah.
You know, Claudia spoke highly of you. You and I got a chance to meet. I've been digging into your background here, get a good sense of who you are, what you do.
Fantastic.
But maybe to put a little bit of a context to this conversation, and just so I don't miss anything, I'd love you to take a couple minutes and just give us a little bit background on who Tim is and certainly who Tim the professional is. I think I got a clear idea, but I think it'd be helpful for the listeners before we sort of dive into any of your habits and mindsets.
Yeah. So who I am as a professional, I was the kid growing up who was always a tinkerer, always looking to solve problems around him. So as an example, in middle school, my school didn't have a lacrosse team. I played town lacrosse, and so on a vacation, I took the catalog and spec'd out the cost of all the equipment and put a budget for a coach and buses and the whole 9 yards, and then pitched the head of my school that spring on why we should have a lacrosse team. So it's kind of like I've always kind of had that driven mindset to say, if I want to do something, figure out a way to do it, and that carried from a young age through college. I started a late night snack delivery business in the DC metro area during my sophomore year in college. Learned a lot of lessons from that, one of which is how we got 10,000 free condoms and used that as a marketing strategy for a company, which makes for a great headline. And then transitioned into finance. And I raised, as we talked about, $300 million before the age of 25. And that was just purely on the idea of I knew exactly who we were and what our value proposition was and who the audience was. And just like a bulldozer, just went and kind of did it, and it was a great experience for me, and it kind of in my early professional life.
So you've always had this entrepreneurial spirit. I'm so curious, going back to maybe even the lacrosse thing. So that was the first thing you mentioned. What is it about that process that gets you going? Is it? Yeah, what is it?
Yeah, so I think even to this day, my parents would say, if there was an easy road and a hard road, I would take the hard road. And I think for some reason, I don't quite honestly know why, but I think as best as I can tell, I grew up, my dad was in the financial services area. I grew up in an environment where we were encouraged to take chances, and I was fortunate enough to be in a position where, we weren't struggling to put food on the table. I had a great education, and I think that was just the call it the psychological safety net of, even if everything goes badly, I think I'm going to be okay. And so I think I was always a risk taker, and that has a couple of different kind of edges to that sword. But I think it comes from just having a drive in me, and parents and an environment to kind of spur on dreaming big and taking big shots, and a lot of small wins along the way have kind of proven that I can do a lot of things probably far outside my existing capability. But I've always chased those.
I love that. It's so interesting too, because I think anybody that has entrepreneurial, I guess, aspects, it's not always like you had them from like day one, but I think a lot of entrepreneurs had some of that at a very early age. Either you're making something and trying to sell it, or I don't know, maybe you excelled in like, bake off goods, or who knows what it
Yeah.
was, crafts. But I can remember at a very early age too, the love for building something. I was always so fascinated. And even with the first company that I built, Modernize, just the idea of like, and this was a little later in my life, of like, you can take an idea, just an idea you have in your mind, and with, not just hard work and perseverance, but some of that, you can turn it into something. And I thought it was so cool that one day, if you were lucky enough to like build a meaningful business, somebody would buy it from you.
Yeah.
And just the concept of going with like, wow, this didn't exist until me and my buddies built it, to the idea that like someday somebody would pay money for it. And in our case, we ended up selling a company for just under 70 million. And it was like just mind boggling. Like, this business wouldn't have been here without us. And yet we took it from ideation to creation. And I think whether you're building a big company, a small company, there's just such a cool aspect of, if you can see it in your mind, you can eventually hold it in
Yeah.
your hand. You've raised all this money. What are you doing now, though? Because you're not raising money anymore, right? Like, you do consulting, you're a business coach for entrepreneurs, right?
Yeah, but the model I've chosen to follow, and a lot of it is, I believe in kind of the relationship side of value exchange. So the idea of traditional consulting, which is pay me some money on, hopefully I'll tell you something that works, didn't really always resonate with me. And so I basically have aligned myself as a co-creative partner, or the number two guy for
Yeah.
up and coming entrepreneurs. So one thread through my career has been, I excel in collaborative environments. And number two, I've excelled in being kind of the number two guy to the number one guy. So that looks in recent past as, as Alex Hormozi's number two at Gym Launch. I was the number two guy at the hedge fund that I built. I've been the number two guy in a couple of other areas. So I really like that positioning, where I can kind of be in the room and in the conversation in a more of a support role. And so when I was thinking about consulting, me sitting by myself behind a computer had no interest to me. I'm a social person. I get the best out of, conversation. And so I said, what if I align my interests, which is something I've always felt strongly about, with this kind of collaborative element and overcoming entrepreneurial isolation, and the idea that most entrepreneurs do need someone in that capacity. And so that's what call it a junior partner, call it a silent partner, a minority investor. It looks a lot of the same things, which is, I own a piece of the company, a minority piece of the company, and in exchange, hopefully, what might bring to the table increases the value of the company over time. And so that's primarily how I get paid, is through some kind of growth on the rev share, or the enterprise value, and sometimes both.
So you're placing a lot of bets, is what you're doing.
I'm actually, it's interesting because right now I had the fortunate position to have, kind of, once I left Gym Launch, I was a free agent, and my network kind of heard about this. And so people were coming to me. And now I'm really looking at like, well, what do I want to do kind of for the next five to 10 years plus? And finding new folks to kind of expand my network and to be able to engage with is something that's really enjoying for me. It feeds my energy. But taking someone who's never worked with, that I've never worked with, and they've never worked with me, and go straight into that relationship is just, that's like going from, going to the bar and asking someone to get married. It's way too big of a bite size, too big of a leap. And so I'm fostering this co-creative community as kind of a way for people to get kind of in my network and maybe get in theirs, see, do we like each other? Does it work?
Mhm.
Kind of iron out all the kinks, and then say, of that group of people, are there ones who I feel I've kind of earned the right to help consult with and be partners with. And so I've taken a longer time frame by doing that, but it feels much better now. And in the meantime, I can help more people, and expand my network and influence and things along those lines.
I love that. I want to hone in on a piece of this just to make sure I understand the context, because I think this is actually useful for a lot of people that are entrepreneurs. And look, even if you've built a company, no two companies are the same. Some people might say, "Hey, look, dude, I built a company, I can build another one." And I know from my personal experience, like I built one company and I remember building it and I was like, "Oh, this is the hardest thing I've ever done." And then you sell it and you're like, "Well, it wasn't so bad." And then I'm trying to build another one and I'm like, "My God, this is nothing like the first one. Like, this is
Yeah.
so hard." So I don't always think like just because you were successful before, you'll be successful again. And clearly there's a lot of first time entrepreneurs out there. But what I wanted to hone in on is this concept of, and I don't want to misconstrue the way you've sort of defined your role, but some of the things I've read is that sometimes the difference between the person creating the company, you can almost define that person as like the visionary,
Mhm.
like the person that has the vision. They're really good with coming up with ideas, but being a visionary does not necessarily mean you're a good CEO, you're a good
Mhm.
executor. And I think there's a lot of people out there that would be like, well, that makes a lot of sense because I got a shit ton of ideas, but they don't always translate into stuff. So I'm curious, like
Yeah.
with you taking on this number two role,
Yeah.
do you feel more comfortable in that because it's not your idea, because you don't have to come up with it and it's a little bit more on the execution? Or like, how do you see yourself in that number
Yeah.
two role as it relates to being the visionary versus like more of the person bringing structure and providing execution on the vision?
Yeah. So my sweet spot is kind of 500,000 to $3 million a year in revenue is typically when I
Okay.
work with folks, and hopefully grow it larger than that. But that phase, there's not really the budget for kind of CEO to get paid and a full-time COO, CFO. The C-suite isn't
Yeah.
quite able to be formed in that way. So I get this question a lot. It's like, what's the difference between a number two and a COO? I kind of sit in between, just in the kind of revenue size, kind of between those two roles. So yes, there needs to be a visionary, but you can have a head of operations or something like that doing a lot of the day-to-day blocking and tackling. But the thing that I think is the biggest value is, number one, I've sat in the seat before, so I know what the CEO is kind of thinking, the the trade-offs, the influences, things like that. But they need someone who can take that vision and that idea and both help provide clarity out of the confusion that's for themselves going forward, but then looking kind of side and back, bringing the team along. How does that get translated in those kind of functional units to be able to make progress? And they want to continue to look forward. Maybe they don't have the experience as an operator, but I can kind of bridge the gap between those two. And just to put a story around this, I have a great mentor of mine, sold a company for a couple of $1 billion a few years ago. And I asked him, I said, if you were to summarize me to someone in your network, what would you say is the most important kind of thing for them to know? And he said, unlike anyone I've really met, you can be both strategic and tactical in the same conversation. And he said, I think your value is the fact that you can see both the forest and the trees when you are coming up with ideas, giving suggestions, providing clarity. And I thought that kind of summarized it well. So it's not just, there's a bigger mountain for us to take or something like that, looking over the horizon. It's, I can actually understand by making these plans, that's what it means to everybody else who's coming behind and what that means for the execution within the organization.
I love that. I really appreciate the additional clarity on that. So let me ask you this here as we start to like segue into like your personal habits and mindsets. It's really stressful to be an entrepreneur. Like, I mean, maybe not for everybody. Like, I totally recognize, like, hey, there's some people out there that might just be, we'll pretend you haven't really made it yet, right?
Yeah.
You're still in the red. You're still forming everything. It's a hot wreck, we'll say. So more in that boat. But let's be honest, like, it is stressful, and even for those that are successful, if they're fortunate enough to run a very large company, like, it's how do you run your company, not let your company run you.
Mhm.
And I think one of the things that I remember very vividly is in the first company I built, for after the first 5 or 6 years, the last checkbox that I had was just, could I sell this thing?
Mhm.
Like I wasn't trying to be a better manager. I wasn't trying to get bigger or any of those things. I was like, look, dude, like we obviously did something. Once we got north of 20 million, 30 million, I was like, okay, clearly we've built something here. Like, how do we just get paid out? And it was
Yeah.
very much like, how do we get paid out? And, I lost a little bit of sight on enjoying life. I didn't let my health deteriorate because I'm very much into like taking care of yourself. But my point is like, it became less about enjoying the journey and it became very fixated on the outcome. And I recognize for a lot of entrepreneurs that may be the case, and maybe they're not as diligent with their health or their family. I mean, I know
Mhm.
you're married, I know you have kids. They're only young once, and so I guess the question I'm trying to ask here is, without getting specifically in your habits, like how have you balanced the stress of being an entrepreneur and working in that with companies that haven't really made it yet? Like how do you view that process?
So my earlier self was a volume player, which was, just sheer force. That was kind of how I started my career. And it worked for a period of time, but I think that all the things that you just mentioned are the things that kind of start to creep in. And most of the people I'm fortunate enough to work with today are married, typically have kids because it's kind of the chapter that I'm in my life as well. And so I'm able to kind of bring that point of view, unlike some other folks who might be single and have different recommendations. But for me, I think what I've learned, and I don't know if I was the best at this early on, but where I am today is I think I've done a really good job of separating the things that truly matter. And that's not waxing poetic, but I remember earlier when I was kind of at the start of my career, everything was a fire, everything was to be dealt with, everything was to be, it was kind of urgent and important, right? Everything was kind of in that quadrant. And I think I've just learned over time that probably 80 or 90% of the things don't really matter in the long term. And I spend more of my time now pulling back from execution. And some people call it planning, strategy, whatever word you want to use. But being more cognizant of, is this something to be solved? Or is this something to be managed? Or is this something to be ignored? Like, will it just resolve itself? Is it something that customer service is a great example? You could say, I want to bring all customer complaints to zero. That is a problem to be solved, or that kind of thinking. Customer feedback is something to be managed. You're never going to get 100% of happy people. You won't nail it every single time. It's just a definition of kind of the way life works. But if it's to be managed, that's different. That means that when a customer comes in or a client comes in with a complaint or feedback, it doesn't mean, oh my God, let's stop the presses. Everything's broken. We have to go, everybody focus on why this has gone wrong. It's like, maybe we just missed. Is there a process change we have to make? Was it something implicit in the product? Like, where is the actual problem? Instead of it being, we're horrible entrepreneurs and everybody's going to hate us here and all, which I've seen. If you were early in your career and you're one of these people that like, you think it's always going to be positive, feedback, it's just not reality. And so I think now I try to take it in stride, I guess is in summary, without going into the habits.
Is that something you just have to earn your stripes on, or can you? I'm always curious, and we're going to segue into your habit in a second, but I'm always fascinated with like, can you pull that lesson forward from somebody else's experience, or is it
Yeah.
something you literally have to go through yourself? Because I'll agree. I mean, I can think of over the years, I'm like, God, that was a fire, and like,
Yeah.
the world is crumbling. Like, oh my God. I mean, there were so many times in Modernize where like, this is the year we're going to sell it, and we got to really be on point the next 3 months, and then it would fall through, and
Yeah.
something just bad timing, and then you make it to the other side, and you're like, well, but my point is like,
Yeah.
is it something that you have to personally go through, or do you think you can actually learn that lesson from other people?
Yeah. I think it has to do, and you touched on it a minute ago, which is I have met entrepreneurs when I asked them why they started, it was like to create this thing and sell it. If your reason for starting is the exit, typically that is a false pretense on which to start the journey. Where I have seen it go very well is, and in that case, it's like a piece of feedback, a complaint or what have you, or something not going right, or a missed deadline, or a milestone that we fell short on, is is no longer in service of the goal. Like if I'm to sell it, then all of these things are impediments to me getting top dollar for the thing that I want to get out of, probably before you even start. If you're part of the process and you understand the process has ebbs and flows to it, and that you are not trying to hit a defined deadline, immediately, you can kind of take some of those things in stride, because it's not in the face of the short-term goal that you have laid out. So to answer the question, I think it's an awareness that has to happen, but I think you can lose the game before you start, if it's, like I said, founded on this kind of false pretense of, I'm going to launch the product, everyone's going to love it, my MRR is going to go through the roof, this thing's going to be indefensible, and then someone's going to pay me tons of money for it. If that's your opinion, I think time will actually solve some of those problems. But if you pull your time frame too close, like I'm going to do this in the next 12 to 24 months, then everything will look like a fire, because it's at risk of the thing that you're trying to hit.
Yeah, well said. All right. I felt like I needed to extract or tease out of you a little bit of your background as an entrepreneur, because so many people that even been on this podcast, although their backgrounds are a little bit different than yours, they're running their own little brands. And
Yeah.
although there is differences in the way that goes, you still are an entrepreneur. And so I just recognize that there could be a lot of stress involved with it. And look, at the end of the day, having a bunch of money, selling your company, launching your product, whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish is wonderful, but it is a milestone.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, if you have kids, they're only young once. You can't let your health slip too far behind, because you'll just spend the rest of your life trying to regain it. So I wanted to get a little bit of context to the way that you've gone about your life here. But let's dive into you specific. And I've actually seen some of this on your channel here, so I'm so curious where we're going to take it. But right now, like, what would you say is like the habit that is supporting your mental health, your well-being, your success the most at this stage in your life?
Yeah. So for me, and I will be quite frank, I thought journaling and things like that was probably this like woo-woo kind of thing. Like I don't have time for that. I lived in that headspace for quite a long time, until somebody said to me, they said the phrase, a gentleman named Sharon Srivatsa, a great mentor of mine, said, "Fear has no place on paper." And he said it because I think I was struggling with having all this stuff going around in my head. It was confusion. It was, lack of confidence to be able to, look at things objectively. And he encouraged me to kind of basically do daily brain dumps. Like in the morning, tell me what, just get everything off your head. And then the fear does not have, has no place on paper, is the idea of looking at what's in our head on paper. It feels differently. It's just different. The weight literally can come off. And you can go, oh, that's interesting, I had that thought. Or, oh, yeah, I got to do that. For me, sometimes it's open loops that I didn't close from the prior day or week or month or what have you. And it has given me an objectivity around my mindset and my headspace that I didn't have prior. Instead, I was kind of trying to hold it all in and file it away. And I struggled to do it, I will say, with any level of success, until I started doing, again, kind of a brain dump every morning. And it's completely unstructured in the beginning, because I'm the type of person that my brain is going 1,000 miles a minute, and I just need to get it out. And then I can structure it, and then it can go into a to-do list or a calendaring or whatever it might be from there.
I like that. Journaling in some capacities come up on this podcast, but it's been a little bit more in the context. And I think you've mentioned this, is like the night before, maybe writing out your priorities of what you need to do the next day, or in the morning, writing out the priorities of like how you want to tackle your day, but not the idea of brain dumping. So I'm curious, like, when did you start this habit, and what was the rationale for starting it?
About a year and a half ago. And it was because I could feel this level of almost anxiety starting to build, because it was these kind of open loops. And for me, it manifests itself. I kind of exited one chapter of my life and I was starting a new one. And it was fears around, personal brand and identity and acceptance and all of the things that kind of come out when you are a little more vulnerable in something new. And so for me, it was just kind of circling around my head of these probably, negative emotions or thoughts that I was having. And a lot of it was completely unfounded, which is why he encouraged me to do this. It was like, is this thing true? Like, am I going to fail at this? And we're going to lose our house and everyone's going to think I'm the laughing stock or whatever it might be. And it's like, objectively know, but in my head, I could kind of go through those thought patterns. And so for me, it was less around the tactical things like, what do I need to do? Do my big, clear the big rock first thing in the morning. It was more of like, what's all the junk in my head that's actually preventing me from moving forward with confidence? And it was, some things were around, I had kind of gone through a chapter of working more and making some sacrifices on other areas of my life. And I think I had some, I don't know if the right word is guilt or reflection about those times and how I didn't want to repeat some of those. And so I think it was just, for me, it was just kind of getting it out of my head so I could look at it and start to build and craft the type of experience I wanted to have for myself in the next chapter of my life.
You mentioned anxiety. Was that the catalyst to starting all this? Was it like just a buildup of anxiety and that's what led you into that particular habit?
I think that had something to do with it. It wasn't like it wasn't kind of a runaway train, but I could feel this vibration inside of me of like,
Yeah.
I have all these, it was kind of a nervousness, I think is what was coming
Mhm.
out. And so he encouraged me to kind of take this kind of tactical step to say, there is no right or wrong kind of thought, right? Just put it down, look at it and go, does it serve me? Yes, no. Is it something I need to do? Is it just kind of clutter? Like, but the process, part of the value is just going through the process, right? So after I did it for
Yeah.
like a couple of weeks, it was like, oh, I feel a lot better in the morning and I can, you know what I mean? So I think it started to compound and now I almost do it naturally.
So walk us through like the really tactical part. So this is done in the morning for you.
Yeah.
It's not done in the
Yeah.
evening. And I think you said it's less structure and
Yeah.
more just free flowing. So is it
Yes.
I've read that like, hey, write 3 pages or hey, go for 10 minutes. Like how do
Yeah.
you perform this particular habit? What's that
Yeah.
actually look like in your schedule?
Yeah, great. So in the beginning, I was the type of person that I needed some structure. So instead of like sit down with a blank sheet of paper and go until you feel like you want to stop, didn't work for me. So in the beginning, it was, I set a timer for 5 minutes. I was like, in 5 minutes, I'm just going to write down everything. I'm going to sit here. If I write for 3 minutes and I have 2 minutes of empty space, that's fine. 5 minutes. And I just went and wrote down everything I could think of, completely unstructured. And what that means when I say that is it wasn't like, I had, put to-do lists here or thoughts here or whatever. It was literally blank sheet of paper, write it all out, not full sentences, could be phrases, could be words, just very much in flow. After the 5 minutes was over, then I would go back and I would highlight anything
Hmm.
that I needed to kind of go back and think about, or if it was a tactical thing, a to do or something to be scheduled, or I got to do this. Oh, I forgot to do that. I would highlight all of those things, and then I would take the highlights and then put it in a structured form. So if it was an action item, I would put that under action items. If it was just like a general thought, like, oh, that's interesting, I want to come back to that, a business idea, something that wasn't like a tangible thing, a tactical thing for that day, I would put it at the bottom. And every week I would go back and look at the bottom section of that, call it summary. And that was just so that I could keep track of like, oh yeah, I had that thought on Monday. I was going to look into something. I would just want to make sure I don't lose sight of that. So I took the tactical stuff, moved it to calendar. I actually schedule out all my to-dos. So I don't have a to-do list that's endless over here and calendar here. So I literally built it into my calendar and then I throw the piece of paper away. And then it's like, that's my cleansing of like, today's done. I've taken the value and now I'm moving forward and I'll do it again tomorrow.
There's a few things you mentioned there. It was reminding me. I think this gentleman's name's Ernesto. I met him. He's in Europe, and he's like a brain expert, so like a mindset coach in a lot of ways. And I remember he shared a number of videos on the platform I'm building, and a few of the things that you mentioned really stuck out. One, he would do like a brain dump as well, and then he would, but not highlight the stuff he did. He would actually like use a calendar in conjunction with it, and he would highlight in different colors like if his thoughts were sort of like good, bad, or
Mm,
neutral for the day. And what he was trying to get a sense of is like how his thoughts changed over time. So he'd write all this stuff out of it on a calendar. He'd be like, oh, today's a good day, green day, red day, yellow day. And then when he looked back at the calendar, be it a month or a quarter or a year, he could just very quickly visualize, oh, I was really red in the beginning of the year, and now I'm
got
making
it.
progress. But the other thing that stood out too is he would throw the paper away, like some of the notes, and it was like therapeutic in the sense of like I dumped it all out there, I got it in the open, I became the observer of my thoughts,
Mhm.
and now I'm getting rid of this. It was almost like a ceremonial in some sense, which I have never heard of before. But when you were talking about that, it sort of reminded me of that as well. This particular habit of yours, is it something you do every day at this point?
Yes.
Are there any days you miss it?
I can't think of one in the last 18 months that I've missed.
Okay, awesome. That's pretty solid. Yeah, I was
Yeah.
gonna ask you, like, if you missed a day, like, how you felt, but if,
No,
18 months is solid.
yeah, and it could be. I mean, it sounds very. It might sound very structured. Like I have to sit in a dark room and all. It's like if I'm
Yeah.
traveling, I'll just take out a piece of paper and do it. Like it's not. It's more the exercise than the formality of it. Now I do it like I said in 5 minutes. So even if I just have to sit for a second and go, what am I thinking about first thing in the morning? When I do it is something I've tested. Immediately getting out of bed and doing it, that's one thing. Do I wake up and like have a cup of coffee? Like now I get my daughter off to school relatively quickly thereafter. Do I do it before I work out, after I work out? I've kind of tested
Mhm.
not very scientifically, but like, does one feel better than another? I don't have an answer on that yet, but that is something I've over the course of kind of this last quarter or so, I've started to kind of play around with because my schedule's changed a little bit.
Do you remember how you felt when you first started this? And the reason I'm asking that is,
Yeah.
although I don't do journaling, I have done it in the past, and for a similar reason. There was some low level anxiety, but just so many thoughts. And I actually enjoy the free flowing. I know some people prefer more structure, what went well, what didn't, so forth. But I prefer the sort of just literally just like throw up all over a piece of paper, not literally, but just all the words you
Yeah.
got.
Yeah.
And I found it really helpful just to like, if you have a repetitive word, just write that word and just sort of exhaust the brain in a way. But the reason I'm asking the question to you is I recommend it to a lot of people that are trying to make sense and they haven't found the way to sort of do that brain dump or maybe even ask themselves some of those more critical questions. And I noticed that there's just a reluctance to, I don't know if it's the intimacy of
Mhm.
doing it. I don't know if it's just foreign to them, but I'm curious, do you remember what it felt like when you first started doing that?
Yeah. It felt incredibly, it was like my vulnerability being put on paper. I remember very vividly that I was almost judging myself the first time I did it. Like
Mm,
I was almost screening my own thoughts. Like I knew it was supposed to be kind of this free flowing thing, but I was like, what if I write that down? And I think for me, and again, I remember this pretty vividly. It was like I was almost, if I wrote it down, it was almost like I was telling myself it was true.
mm.
Like I was judging myself by like, oh, I had that thought. Like by putting it on paper, I can no longer hide it in the back of my head. It was like a real thing now, and now I had to deal with it, which is the blessing and the curse, I think, to some extent. And I'm not, we're not talking kind of grandiose things, but like mm, there's something that I'm like for purposely not addressing.
Yeah.
But when I put it on paper, it's like that thing's something I'm thinking about, and I keep avoiding it. Which now I have to deal with it. Now I'm like, well, why am I avoiding it? Like what? Like this thing is a thing now. Does that make sense? That's kind of how I felt in the beginning. It wasn't this. This is awesome. Everything's coming out. Like it sounds really kind of even keeled. I think at the beginning it was the manifestation of the things that I probably put kind of further back in my head, that I'm now forcing to kind of open Pandora's box, in some cases.
It is so interesting. I mean, I have so many conversations with myself. I do my journaling while I'm running in a lot of
Mm,
ways of just, asking myself. I was doing a podcast episode with a good friend the other day, and we were talking about procrastination. And he's like, well, what do you procrastinate on? I'm like, dude, there's plenty I procrastinate on. And I ask myself all the time, I'm like, why am I procrastinating on this? And I was
yeah,
like, dude, I'm overwhelmed. It's like, in asking yourself those really intimate questions is really tough. And I
yeah,
can see that a lot of people, there's a reluctance. But what I find so fascinating is like y- you have those thoughts regardless of whether you're putting them on paper or not.
hmm,
It's just the act of putting them on the paper. You feel so much more exposed. But I know
yes,
there's a lot of questions that we're asking ourselves individually. We all do it. And for those people that are choosing not to put pen to paper and maybe it's building up in their mind, I think there is some relief that they can get putting on paper. But I do recognize that there's just yeah, I mean, to your point, I think you said it well. It's just a vulnerability to just accepting that, even if you choose never to share that paper, which most people don't. with anybody other than yourselves. I mean, you even throw your paper away. So there's
Yeah.
no evidence of it.
Yeah.
But it's just interesting how people are so reluctant to do that. Is there I know this is about you, but just having gone through that experience yourself, 18 months, you haven't missed a day. So I mean, you're well into 500 plus days of doing this. It's
Yeah.
definitely helped you. Is there any advice you might give to somebody who's having some level of anxiety, a buildup of thoughts, and maybe reluctant to put them out there?
Yeah, I think for me it was, and I use the phrase kind of open loops purposefully because I realized the
Yeah.
things that were holding me back were the things that were really that were giving me that anxiety. It was like these like incomplete items that were in my head, like, oh, I started this thing or I committed to this thing and I didn't do it, and it's that was really what was building up, and I needed to clear that, and so we're probably all familiar with the phrase like and I'm probably paraphrasing, you know, when you think about meditation or anything like, or working out, it's like, well, I don't have time to work out for a half an hour. It's like, well, then you should probably be working out for 2 hours or something like that. It's like, for me, that's what it was. It was like, oh, I don't have time for this. I'm busy doing these other things. It was like, that was the key for me, where I had to do something different because adding more to that pile was not getting me to where I wanted to go. And it was really transformative. I openly, I have a therapist that I've talked to for a number of years now. That is something I wish I started earlier because I think one of the themes that came out for me was this: the objectivity of that exercise that we were just talking about was really important for me because I think I was almost judging myself for having all these unopened loops. That by clearing them, it was actually a victory, and it actually showed that I could control a lot of these things that felt more out of control when they were in my head. And so, if you feel powerless or confused or things like that, start small, set a timer for a minute, and consistency beats anything else. It's like working out, you know, consistency matters, and it'll get more comfortable.
Yeah, no, I love that. One of the things I found really helpful is I read a number of books on neuroscience. One, I just find it so fascinating the way that
Yeah.
our brain is working. And by no means after 5 books that I felt like I was an expert. If anything, I felt more dumb. But there were the few key things that really stood out to me. And one of them was the fact that, and I find sometimes understanding a little bit of the science behind it, I feel like sometimes takes the edge off of the problem. And in this
Mhm.
particular context, like some of the things I learned was like humans have like 40 to 70,000 thoughts per day. Like we are thinking machines.
Machines. Yeah.
And so a few other things that sort of build on that in no particular order was the fact that the vast majority of our thoughts center around ourselves. And this is not for everybody. Some people spend more time thinking about others, but in general, the center of the universe is me. And for you, it's probably you. A lot of our thoughts are very repetitive.
Mm-hmm.
They tend to have a negative bias to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're like, wow, so I got
Oh.
like 70,000 thoughts a day. They're all about me. They're negative. They're highly biased. They're repetitive.
Yeah.
And then I also, and obviously it should, make complete sense is like a lot of our thoughts are not facts. They are just thoughts.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. I find that helpful to like sort of stack some of those things together and be like, whenever I get into like this doom loop, you call it, open loops. I think of it like tabs on a computer, right? You just got a bazillion tabs open or
Yep.
monkey mind, different ways you go about it. Is that's the human condition. Like, I mean, there are probably some that don't face that, but like 8 billion of us, that is the way the human is wired. And I take some comfort in that, knowing
Yeah.
like, okay, Tim's just like me. I'm
That's
just
right.
like Tim. Like we're all together. This is just the way we're wired. So how do we cope with the fact that maybe our brain in some ways doesn't always have our best interest at heart? We have these repetitive thoughts and whatnot. And
Yeah.
I don't know, I find sometimes there's a comfort in that, knowing that like I just got to learn how to deal with it because this was just the way I was built.
Yeah. I completely agree with that because at least it gives you the context of or the environment in which some of these things are taking place where, it and I think there was some solace in that. One thing that did help me though, and the gentleman you mentioned who kind of said this is a red day, I wear a Whoop, and so every morning it's like,
Yeah.
what was the quality of my sleep? For example, was one of the things that kind of comes up there. And some people I've spoken to have said I can't wear a Whoop or an Apple Watch anymore because if I wake up in the morning and it says I had great sleep, or if I had terrible sleep, it's a self reinforcing idea, right? And so I think one of the things that helped me was kind of taking whatever the context is of that day. So even if it's skewed in a certain direction, it's like by clearing it first thing in the morning, it no longer kind of holds any weight over how the rest of the day goes. So let's just say today's a red day. The question I would ask is like, so what? Like, what are you going to do with that information? Like, yes, there's context and understanding, but just because it's a red day doesn't mean that I'm going to change my schedule and I'm going to basically sit at home and, say, well, today's a red day. I'm just not going to have it, whatever. It's like, so what? So like, okay, for me, it was helpful to say, okay, this was the thought that I was having, or this is the context in which I kind of started the day. But by putting it on paper, it really did almost normalize kind of my starting point because I wasn't carrying that stuff. So it's like, okay, today's a red day. So what? It just means I got to really just be sensitive to the fact that I might be more reactive or whatever. It's information, but I'm still going to go about my day. It's not an excuse or a reasoning for me to do anything other than what I set out to do that day.
I love that too, because I can totally relate to it. I always think of it as like subscribing to the program, right? So like when you talk about red days, I think sometimes it's also just like whether we're talking about an injury or a sickness, like you got to be very careful of how you start to identify as that problem or that mood or whatnot, because it can be very self-fulfilling. Me and my wife will jokingly say that we wake up really early. So today we got up at like 3:30 in the morning, and first thing we're doing is like making a cup of coffee. But she messed up when she made the cup of coffee. I don't know how she did. We have a grinder, and then you put it into the press, and she messed up and forgot to grind. Anyways, like I walked in, Tim, and like there's fucking coffee everywhere. Like it's just all last thing you want to do when you wake up in the morning, let alone that early, is like do more work than you thought you need to. And so she's jokingly like, I hope this is not like an indicator of how this day is going to go about, because if it is, like I got a long time to go, and this is so anyway, you got to be very careful of like, to your point, hey, maybe the information's helpful. And if you don't find it helpful, don't wear the watch. Don't track the day. I do believe there's some element. I think it's all about sort of trial and error to figure out like what works for you. If it works for you and it's positive and motivating, do it. If it doesn't, maybe you just kick that out of your routine altogether. Let's pivot over to mindset. So sort of in a similar fashion, is there a particular mindset for you right now that is contributing the most to your mental health and your well-being and your overall success?
So I think for me, when you say mindset, as far as like, I think where I am right now as a father of three who has actually prioritized kind of the family side of who I am in recent years. And so, I think trying to be more present with them is something that's important. So I didn't do the best job. Some people call it work-life balance, work-life integration, things like that. My mindset is I want to be all in with whatever I'm doing, and I don't think I did a great job of that kind of in some years past. So I think that could be kind of one thing. Exercise is just as a mindset for me has been something I've reprioritized. I had shoulder surgery earlier this spring, which I probably used as an excuse on why I didn't work out as much as I should just prior. But in the last kind of 6 months or so, is something that has become more forward in my mind, because I've realized, as this is not going to be shocking to anyone, obviously the more I move, the better off I generally feel. And so I think I lost sight of some of those underlying things as far as it related to how I was showing up throughout the day.
Let's I'll try to tackle both of them here, but let's start with being the present, because that absolutely resonates with me. I do a vision board every year, and over the years they've gotten incredibly simple. I've got less goals. The goals just get more complex. They get bigger, and one of the big ones, and I took up a lot of my vision board last year, I literally just carried it over to this year, is enjoying the journey. And I have this really rich understanding that my kids are only young once.
Yeah.
And I'm at that threshold where I don't, how old are your kids, Tim?
10 to 14.
Okay. So you're right there too. I mean, my oldest is about to turn 12, my youngest about to turn 10. And like, let's be honest, like there's only so many more years where we're cool, where they want to snuggle and get hugged and all that good stuff. And, we're the superheroes of their life. I'm very aware that that is going to go away. And I heard a really talk about a stat that, for some people this may not do well, but by the time your children turn 18, 97% of the time you spend with your children in their life is over. Now, this isn't on average. So clearly some people have really highly connected families, but if
Yeah.
you think about it, your kid goes to college and whatnot, you only get together for a couple hours here and there. And like I think about that, I'm like, oh my God, like my kid, like I love my kids. Like by the time they're 18, like how many more years do
Yeah.
I got? Like, so I'm
Yeah.
very aware that like you don't get those years back. And that's just the child part of it. You've got a wife or a husband, you've got your health. And my point being is like I'm very aware of like we only have the present moment. We don't have the future. And all these cool things we're aspiring to do, sell a company, get a promotion, whatever that may be, they are only but milestones or moments in our lives. I
Mhm.
remember when I sold my company, and keep in mind, like this is what I was like marching towards for like a decade. I remember getting the call, we sold, da, 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 great. I didn't feel any more successful in that moment. I was
Yeah.
it was like, oh my God, okay, great. I got a little bit more in my bank account, but like, holy
Yep.
crap, like there is no like I'm not on the cover of a magazine, like, and even if I was, like, the moment's there, it's gone, like, we'll go to a dinner, we'll celebrate, it's over, like, now
Yep.
what? And
Now
so my
what?
point is,
Yeah.
like, how do you specifically, how do you stay present when you have all of these competing domains of your life, ambitions, goals? Like, how do you set them aside? Like, I have to imagine that's not easy.
Yeah. So the context of how I kind of hear the question is like these dueling forces, right? And are they kind of which side? It's like a push and a pull, right? The age old kind of struggle. I think what I've realized is for me personally, I was trying to continue to do more while trying to maintain this balance. Almost like I'm going to do more on both sides, but the balance will be equal. And what I realized was I actually needed to do a lot less than I was doing than I thought and I can handle a lot less than I probably think I can, management wise, like juggling all the balls. And so for me, I made sure that I was really aware of kind of Pareto's law, like what is the 80-20 rule, and trying to be really aware of which is this an 80% or 20% thing. And so I put about 6 months ago, I put out a document. I called it my intention document. And it says, here's where I
Mm,
was, here's where I am, here's where I'm going, here's what I am willing to accept, and here's what I'm not willing to accept in my life, personally and professionally. And I published it. It's on Facebook. You can go out and look at it. And it basically says, this is the business I'm building. And if you don't agree with that, or if this is not your thing, then we're not, it's no harm, no foul, but this is how I see the world. And the second I did that, it gave me, and putting it out publicly, it almost gave me something to remind myself and everybody else around me. I created a world where I said, if you expect me to be on Zoom calls every hour, 5 minutes after you message me, that's just not the way I'm going to do this anymore. I will get back to you every day, but here are the terms under which we're going to do this. And I set those expectations. And it turned some people away. But I had to become even more clear and transparent. And to some extent, I had to set the standard high. And that document for me was my tangible physical evidence of me calling my shot in the world. And I could refer back to it and say, I already put it out there. If you're the type of person that wants to get on a Zoom call just for the sake of talking and you're never going to do anything, you're not my person. Sorry, because my time is valuable. And here's how I'm going to choose to do it. I'm going to do delivery in 2 days a week. I'm going to do content creation 2 days a week. And I'm taking 1 day a week off. And some of those will be floating, some will be fixed. So I literally put it out there and I just said, if this is the way that you see the world as well and can work within this context, this construct, then you're absolutely my person. And it did what I hoped it would do, which is it turned away the folks that were not a fit, and it drew the other folks so much closer. They were like, thank you. You actually said what I wanted to say. And I thought there was a lot of power in that. So I've now kind of come to the point where, how do I do that? I just am basically much more strict with my own time. And I set my ego aside and say, you can do anything you want, but you can't do everything. And I had to force myself to start to make some choices in that instead of just adding more to the plate.
So this contract, it's interesting. So the way you've described it, you made it sound like it was for the potential people that would work with you, but from what I know about like habit formation, it almost feels like you did it for yourself. Like
100%.
you, like
100%.
you put yourself in a situation that, I guess for lack of better words, like you trapped yourself in
Yeah.
some ways. Like you said, like, hey, like this is the person I'm aspiring to be like. I'm going to put it out there as like a social declaration. Everybody can see it. And by doing that social commitment, it was your way of holding yourself accountable. It sounds like that was the lift you were really going for there.
Yeah, I absolutely believe that to be the case, because I think my ego and my drive, when left unchecked, can probably take me down paths that I may not want to necessarily pursue. So I think it was a good reminder for me to, in outside of like the field of battle, to put down for myself kind of what I saw for the next chapter of my life.
I love that, and I've used social accountability in a number of ways. I think we all need accountability, whether it's for ourselves or maybe even a little bit of pressure of the community. So I love how you've utilized that to your advantage to be more present. I guess the final question I have for you, Tim, here, and we spent so much of this episode focusing on you and your habits, but a question I like to walk away with is let's zoom out a little bit and let's pretend you got a magic wand here. And if you could wave a wand over all of humanity and you could distill down some habit or mindset that nudge us in a more loving and kind direction as a species, is there one habit or mindset that really stands out to you?
I think for me, I would answer, I would hope that people the self had self-awareness and confidence built upon that self-awareness. Knowing who you are and what value you bring and feeling confident that that's enough would be something that I would instill in people across the board. I think we talk a lot about the changes we need to make and the evolutions and things like that. And I've seen it so many times that a lot of people, and I think I was at this place at a point earlier in my life where I didn't really kind of know. I knew what I was good at, but I didn't know who I was. And I think I was trying to kind of look to the outside to find out what that was, or put wins on the board to establish what that might be. I would encourage people to understand that in a deeper context as soon as possible in their life.
I love that, and it's very similar to the wish that I have for all people. I feel like if people had more self awareness, and I think with that comes a certain level of self compassion and self love. That I think it just makes you a better person, and the better person you are, the more that sort of has a ripple out effect for other people. So well said. Where can people go to learn more about you, Tim? Where's the right place to send them?
Yeah, yeah. So best place is Instagram is tim.calise. That's TimCalise. I'm also on LinkedIn, and website is timcalise.com. And as a listener of this show, DM me the word standard on Instagram, and I'd love to send you a special gift for being a supporter of this episode.
Awesome. Tim, thanks so much for coming on, dude. This was a really fun conversation. I think there's a lot of similarities I see in like the way you go about your life and myself. So I really enjoyed having you on. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Standard. Before we go, click on the link in the show notes of this episode to learn more about today's guest. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with somebody who you think would benefit from it as well.